I've been interested in ships all of my life. I'm half Danish and first got fascinated traveling backwards and forwards across the North Sea in the days before EasyJet and Norwegian, when one had to sail. And I harbored an ambition as a teenager that I might like to be a naval architect, but unlike the fine people in this room, I was insufficiently numerate. So I did the obvious thing. Having failed in that, I became a terra firma architect, trained at Glasgow School of Art, and that didn't work out either, but more for economic reasons. So I then became an academic, and I've now for 20 years plus been a design historian at Glasgow School of Art, but I've never really left shipping behind, because I realized that shipping is a subject that really has not been addressed within the field of design history. And it's a subject that rather lends itself to design historical discourses, because shipping is a global industry. And there's an engineering component, but there's also a component that deals with political economy, and ships are, consumed in various ways. Modern ships are consumed in various ways by different end users. And it's a very exciting time to be involved in shipping because of our global economy. And, as never before, although globalization is often said to be a fairly recent thing of the latter 20th and early 21st centuries, it has a long tail story. So in my professional life, amongst writing on other subjects, I've produced a range of books about ships. And one that I'm particularly proud of is my comprehensive history of the Danish naval architecture company Knud Hansen, about which I spoke when last invited to speak to RINA in Glasgow. This book, incidentally, I think, unless you know differently, is the very first monograph on the history of a major naval architecture firm that's designed for not only shipping people and the profession itself, but also a general audience. And remarkably, or maybe not so remarkably, it's now in 4 editions. So it just shows that there's interest. I've also written about ferry design, books about how Denmark came to be a leading nation in liner shipping, and even works on bits of ships. Some years ago, I was asked by the Technical University of Denmark to make a work on the development of the Kappel propeller. And I also, a little later, made a book about cargo speed, the famous Greenock supplier of cranes and vehicle deck access equipment for ferries and ro-ro vessels. So there's a fair range of books about ships. But the newest thing I've produced is a work of just over 100,000 words on the design of the interiors of ships built on the Clyde between the 1860s and the 1960s. It's entitled Lusitania to QE2, the Great Clyde-Built Ships and the Creation of Their Interiors. That title was worked out with the publisher with a view to market, that if you name ships like Lusitania and QE2, people will be immediately interested. And we'll just put the creation of the interiors to a subtitle underneath, because, he didn't think that would sell as much. But the book has been produced and it's very, very nice looking. And it was a little bit of a nail biter before Christmas, because he started to have cold feet because of the very, very difficult public publishing situation on account of the effects of Brexit and the Ukraine war on costs. So there were some strong words over the telephone. And in the end, he followed through, and the end justifies the means, in my opinion. So what the book is mostly about is essentially this aspect of the creation of ships. There have been many works on the story of Clyde shipbuilding. There have been social histories of labor. There have been business histories of shipyard management. There have been technical histories of engineering practices. Clyde shipbuilding has been looked at from pretty much every angle. But the one aspect that's not been looked at until now is the bit that passengers saw the most, which is how the ship's magnificent interiors were created and installed. And this image here taken in the latter 1940s, shows the first-class smoking saloon on Cunard's Caronia being installed by craft joiners from the company GT Rackstraw of London, who made the room and brought it as a kit of parts. This is a standard practice, and installed it inside the ship. And there's a color image of the completed interior. This space may have been made in the south of England, but it actually was designed in Glasgow by an architectural firm that will feature quite a lot in this lecture, called McInnes Gardner. It is still in business, incidentally, based in Lydna Crescent up in the park area of the city, and very proud the company still is of its earlier involvement in the design of ship interiors. We have to go a little bit before the official start date in order to contextualize how the Clyde came to produce passenger ships with opulent saloons. And one point of origin that I think is a tenable one is what happened in the wake of the visit of Queen Victoria to the West Highlands in 1847. For this visit, a special barge was built to carry the royal party through the Crinan Canal. And it was decorated by the Clyde steamship entrepreneur David Hutchison, who later became a major ship owner on the Scottish West Coast, and then sold his company to David McBrain. So Hutchison was really the forerunner of the current Caledonian McBrain in offering West Coast shipping services. But one of the first things he did was to make a luxury interior for the royal barge for Queen Victoria, a little bit different from the cafeteria on today's Caledonian Isles, for example. Now, in the 19th century, it was a period of tremendous fascination with royalty and the sort of the aristocratic hierarchy. So wherever the Queen went, it meant that the upwardly mobile from all other walks of life had to follow. And not missing an opportunity, Hutchison branded the service from Glasgow to Ardrishig as the royal route, and built a succession of saloon steamers in the 1850s and the 1860s to operate it. The concurrent happening of the American Civil War was very helpful in this enterprise, because every autumn the Clyde steamer owners, including Hutchison, would sell their existing vessels to the Confederates for use as blockade runners and order a new vessel for delivery the next spring for the tourist season. And so during the duration of the American Civil War, Clyde saloon steamer design moved forward very, very quickly. And the vessels became faster, more technically advanced, and more opulently appointed. And one might say that the Clyde saloon steamer reached its apotheosis very early with, for example, the Columba of 1878, which was positively sumptuous, really a floating hotel for day trips on the Firth of Clyde and over at Loch Fyne. This is a vessel that was still in service in the 1930s and which my Scottish grandfather vividly remembered sailing on. And interestingly, whereas pretty much every other passenger ship in existence at that time and for a long time thereafter had saloons with long tables in naval wardroom style, the Columba possibly was the first passenger ship in the world to have a restaurant just like on terra firma with individual tables. And this is something that Cunard and Hamburg America, the various other transatlantic lines, as we'll see, picked up on, but not for at least another quarter of a century. Here was McBrain's offering this kind of standard already in the late 1870s. With regard to deep sea travel, events happened apace. And a very early and innovative Scottish-owned company, though Scottish-owned, though London headquartered, to invest in providing first-class luxury travel for, if you like, long-haul liner routes was the Orient Line, owned by the Anderson family, who came originally from the northeast of Scotland, and who appointed a Glasgow-born and educated, though London-based arts and crafts architect called J.J. Stevenson to design the interiors of their liners of the 1880s and 1890s. So this is the dining saloon of the Ophir, one of their ships from the early 1890s, built on the Clyde. This is another very important project from around the same period. A very strange ship built in Govan for the Russian imperial family for use on the Black Sea. And the idea was that this would be a kind of floating leisure pontoon, a sort of palace that would be able to be moved around, but more with the character of one of the circular warships that had been built for the Russians earlier by Elder's shipyard. Also, similar vessels were built for the Americans for use effectively offshore to defend harbors. The yacht was a complete and utter disaster as a piece of naval architecture. The round shape meant that it almost sank on its delivery voyage, and it was pretty uncomfortable to sail on in anything other than a flat sea. But the interiors were spectacular, and it was a masterpiece of the decorative arts, with the rooms created by William Leaper, Glasgow architect of great imagination, who is probably best known today for his design of the banqueting hall in Glasgow City Chambers. But he designed many other sumptuous interiors in the latter 19th and early 20th centuries. This is one of the spaces on the Levadia, which had decorative tile work by William de Morgan from London and various other enrichments, a fantastic aesthetic movement interior by any standards, and on a Russian yacht. So these vessels set a high early standard for what would later on be achieved. And in the 1880s, competition increased in the transatlantic run and also on the colonial trades, and a succession of bigger and more elaborately appointed vessels were constructed. This is the city of New York, designed internally by an American arts and crafts architect called Clarence Sumner Luce, built at Thompson's shipyard. Later became John Brown and Co. These are interiors for Cunard's Campania and Lucania, built by Fairfield in the early 1890s. Very advanced ships built to naval specifications, and inside decorated by the famous Glasgow decorators, furniture makers, and funeral directors. Is there nothing they couldn't do? Wiley and Lochhead. Really rather spectacular, and note also the Glasgow style carpet in the music saloon of the Lucania. And for the South Africa trade, here we've got the Tantallon Castle and Carisbrooke Castle, built by Fairfield and with interiors by Dunn and Watson. Another architect used by Union Castle, or the Castle line, which became Union Castle, whose work I couldn't find any illustrations recording, was James Marchbanks McLaren, who not only designed ships for Donald Curry, the ship owner, but also designed a whole village in Glen Lyon. So you can see work, shipping money going to make to beautify that very pretty glen up in the Highlands. Back to the Anderson family, and this is from 1900, the Oronsay, built by Charles Connell and Company, with interiors by the Glasgow architect Andrew Noble Prentice, who worked at earlier points with P&O's architect Thomas Calcutt, famed for designing the Savoy Hotel in London, and later on for designing a number of liner interiors for P&O. Now, what is amazing is that the sister ship, the Orontes, when it was scrapped in the mid-1920s at Inverkeithing on the Forth by Ward's, the famous shipbreakers there, well, its first-class dining saloon was rescued in its entirety and reinstalled in a hotel just a little further along the Forth at Aberdour. And that's how it looks today. It's the most remarkable space to walk into because you feel as if you're going into a late Victorian or Edwardian Clyde-Built liner of a sort that one would have imagined had disappeared entirely long ago. And also, for those familiar with grand interiors in Glasgow, banks, places like the Arts Club, the Mitchell Library, and so on, going in, it's a very Glaswegian room. You know, it was built for the London to Australia trade, but it looks simply like a gentleman's club or a bank or a library room in this city. It's got that very particular Glasgow style Art Nouveau stained glass in the ceiling clerestory, and the woodwork is in kind of Beaux-Arts neoclassicism that also seems very typical of here. But this is not the only surviving early 20th century Clyde-Built liner interior that I've discovered through this research. Here's another one designed by the, again, Glasgow-based arts and crafts architects William White and William Flockhart. This is the former first-class saloon of Canadian Pacific's Empress of Britain of 1906, which was scrapped at Stavanger in the 1930s. And in a similar way, the saloon was bought by a local hotelier and was installed there. So here we have that room, very much in a kind of Tudor-Beathan arts and crafts style. Tudor-Beathan was the fake timber beams and infill panels, as seen in oldie-worldy Stratford-on-Avon and other places in the south. Very, very popular in the Edwardian era here, which was a high point of unionism. So Tudor-Beathan was a kind of expression of the Union and the Empire in a national romantic way, if you like. Find it also in the facade of Wemyss Bay Station, for example. That's a very good example on the Clyde coast. The 1900s were a period of tremendous innovation in the technology of ships built in the Clyde. Turbine steamers, which had been developed not so many years before for short sea, channel and coastal trades. Well, the first transatlantic turbine ships were built. A very early example was Allen Line's Virginian from 1905. Also cleverly designed with a view to carrying immigrants westbound, but carrying tourists eastbound, and with cabins that could be collapsed and reassembled so that cargo could be carried in the same spaces when there was less demand in winter, for example. And in terms of the arrangement of the saloons, this ship was also one of the first to have a restaurant-style first-class dining saloon. Cunard quickly copied the Allen line and its new Caronia, illustrated here, which had interiors by the Glasgow architect Robert White. White worked in-house in the John Brown shipyard as effectively its designer of pretty much everything built there. And I reckon he was probably employed or recruited by John Brown on the basis of having won the competition to design Clydebank Library. So it's a handsome, handsome building in the French Beaux-Arts style, and the same approach was applied on the ship interiors White went on to design. So these were rather different from the heavy aesthetic of the late Victorian period. The new look was to be light and to have ivory or white as the background color, with usually refined gilding, kind of in the late style of Versailles, Louis XVI, you know. And this was supposed to enhance the impression of space and make the vessels appear more comfortable and open and less oppressive than the previous generation had been. And White was really up there with what was at that time the latest fashion in luxury interiors. He wasn't such a well-known architect, though, and Cunard was looking already with envy across the North Sea to Germany, where the Hamburg America Company had managed to recruit the designer of the Ritz hotels, Charles Meues, to produce the saloons of its latest luxury ships for the Atlantic. Cunard tried to get hold of Meues, but found that they were debarred by an exclusivity clause with Hamburg America. And so they looked for somebody else to design their next ship. They tried an English architect of country houses called Harold Peto. He initially played very hard to get. The Glasgow architect James Miller, on the other hand, was desperate for the work. Miller wasn't short of work. I think he simply jumped at an opportunity to potentially have designs in liners that would then be seen in New York. So he offered to do the work almost at cost, whereas Peto wanted full Royal Incorporation of British Architects rates. The upshot was that Cunard accepted Miller's offer to design the interiors of the Lusitania, and it also hired Peto to produce those of the Mauretania, which was built on the Clyde. Two very big, fast, four-stack transatlantic steamships that were going to be, simply state-of-the-art in the British merchant fleet. James Miller is a fantastic person. He worked a lot with my Scottish great-grandfather, who was a big builder in Glasgow. So they did a lot of railway work for the Caledonian Railway, for example. But that was just the beginning of what Miller achieved. He designed exhibition pavilions for big exhibitions. He designed commercial blocks. A lot of the big and handsome Beaux-Arts style office blocks that you see in central Glasgow were his work. And they were always very handsomely appointed on the inside. This is part of the interior of his Anchor Line headquarters in St. Vincent Street, which is now a bar and restaurant. And this is of relevance to what I'm going to talk about next, because one of the discoveries I made was that very early on, it was convenient to have ship interiors made by cabinet makers all over the country. And specialist companies who supplied ship interiors began to emerge in the early 20th century with this big upswing in construction and the decision that ships in their first-class accommodation at least should be hotel-like. One such supplier that's of importance and interest is H.H. Martin in Cheltenham, which produced a lot of interiors for Clyde-Built ships, often to designs by architects based in Glasgow. Not only did it produce ship interiors, but it also produced the fine woodwork for many buildings on terra firma in Glasgow. And so the interiors of the Anchor Line building, which Miller designed, also were made in Cheltenham. And actually, quite a lot of the grand buildings in central Glasgow were made by cabinet-making firms in the south. Now, Lusitania was an unprecedentedly complex ship for John Brown & Co. to construct. And the specification documents, which are in Glasgow University Library, are actually quite a fascinating read. They're enormously thick, and they have a lot of description of the design of the interiors that the shipyard was expected to produce. Pages and pages and pages. And for anyone working in higher education, it's fascinating to read, because in first class, everything should be an excellent standard. In tourist class, everything should be a very good standard. In third class, the words in this contract, a good standard. So it's a little bit like learning outcomes that the Quality Assurance Agency would understand. An A grade, excellent, B grade, very good, and so on and so forth. You'll all be familiar, or many of you will be familiar with these kinds of discourses even today. But of course, a ship interior specification or any other kind of specification for design work of this kind is likely to be highly interpretable. I mean, you can describe things as accurately as possible in words, but it's still, not quite clear exactly what excellent or very good or good mean when that actually comes to be interpreted in reality. So the contract seemed to, they believed they thought of everything, and it seemed to go pretty well. But after the Lusitania, a different arrangement was used. The Lusitania was a magnificent ship, and its interiors were spectacular. You can see that the style is very similar to the image I showed of the part of the anchor line building. Unusually for a ship interior, Miller used a lot of plaster work, so it had quite a light atmosphere, and a tremendous design achievement, I think, with Martin of Cheltenham supplying much of the componentry. Interestingly, one of Miller's assistants, the main person carrying out the actual design work in his office, was Alexander McInnes Gardner, and another Miller assistant was David Longden. McInnes Gardner afterwards started his own firm, which I've mentioned already, specializing in ship interiors. Longden went down to Cheltenham to work with H.H. Martin. And this explains the relationship between McInnes Gardner and H.H. Martin that was good for many other ship interior projects. Some images of Lusitania. This is the smoking room, the first-class restaurant. It's also interesting to note that on this and many other ships, the voids between the decks are either circular or oval shaped in order to reduce strain on the structure. The second-class ladies' saloon, the third-class dining saloon. And Lusitania became very influential. Other ships built thereafter shared the same essentially Louis XVI style. This is the Balmoral Castle for Union Castle, designed by William Flockhart, but more or less copying Lusitania's dining saloon. And in this same period, alongside Martin's, a whole lot of other firms came to specialize in ship interior supply. This was a really expanding market in which to be involved. And there's just a few of the names that were to become extremely familiar in the first half of the 20th century, some headquartered in London, others headquartered in Glasgow. Here we're moving on a little bit. This is Andrew Prentice again for Orient Line, also showing the influence of Lusitania and the French Louis XVI style. This is the Orsova for Orient Line from 1909, built by John Brown's, its first-class dining saloon. And here's an image of H.H. Martin's premises in Cheltenham after they moved to expand capacity. This company really offered a one-stop shop in the decorative arts for everything that would be needed to produce luxury interiors. You can see it's a metal workshop, a shop making electrical fittings, a polishing shop, a sculpture, marble and stone carving shop, a foundry to make decorative metal components, a wood carving department, a painting and decoration department, a modeling department to make, figurative sculpture, a fibrous plaster department, and so on. It really was the most amazing complex of decorative arts production in the UK, and became thereafter really, really important, as I've explained. For its next opus on the Clyde, the Aquitania, Cunard at last succeeded in getting hold of Mewis and his British design partner, Arthur J. Davis, who'd worked on the Ritz Hotel in London. And here was another very, very spectacular ship with an extremely elegant and grand interior. And it really represented the apotheosis of Clyde ship interior outfitting before the First World War. After the war, the economy was not as good as it had been before, and it's arguable that the industry on the Clyde never again reached the same heights as it had done in the 1900s. The Treaty of Versailles made the economic situation rather flat, as it effectively emasculated Germany and meant that the whole European economy suffered as a result. So Clyde yards took contracts with tighter margins, and often from slightly less usual customers. This is an interior of a liner built for the Italian Lloyd Sabaudo company by William Beardsmore, called the Conte Verde. And its entire accommodation was actually made in Italy, in Florence, and sent as a kit to Beardmore's yard for installation, with people from the Florentine decorative arts company Copedi and Figli coming along with the parts to supervise it all being put in place. You know, magnificent Italian Baroque. There was nothing about the ship once we were on board to suggest it hadn't been built in Italy, other than perhaps some Magillus hinges on the cabin doors and the builder's plate. If you were sitting in the saloons, you'd have assumed that this was an entirely Italian project, and that was the idea. But thematic interiors that were not necessarily native in understandable ways to the country of origin became increasingly commonplace in the 1920s. I guess as cultures became more mixed, people were increasingly curious about the exotic and the remarkable from elsewhere. Here's a McInnes-Gardner scheme from the latter 1920s for a cross-trading passenger and cargo liner called the Western Prince for the Prince Line, which operated between the continents of North and South America along the Eastern Atlantic seaboard. So this was a ship not going anywhere near Britain after it had been delivered. It was simply trading in the Americas its entire career. But its dining saloon is in a Scandinavian national romantic manner. It must have been very strange going through the tropical Caribbean heat of Central America, sitting in a room looking like a beer killer from Stockholm or Oslo or something. But there you go. I suppose American passengers might have quite liked it. Thank goodness for thermotank air conditioning. That at least meant the temperature would be relatively cool inside. But new inspiration came in the late 20s in the wake of a big exhibition that occurred in Paris in 1925, which was called the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes. And this gave its name to the Art Deco style. The first liner with an Art Deco interior is usually taken to be the French Ile-de-France, which entered service in 1927. But already, here is a Clyde-Built example for Canadian Pacific, not quite as grand, perhaps, as the Ile-de-France, but the Duchess of Bedford and Duchess of Richmond, Duchess of Atholl and Duchess of York for Canadian Pacific had Art Deco interiors, and it's a sign of heading in a new direction very early on. These, incidentally, were designed by London designers, not architects, but a London decorator called Percy Staines, who already had produced other work for Canadian Pacific ashore, including posters and office interiors. Shortly after, in the late 20s, Canadian Pacific, which had not only a transatlantic service, but also a trans-Pacific one, ordered another even bigger ship for the latter, the Empress of Japan, delivered in 1929, again with Percy Staines designing the interior. And it's spectacular. This is only a couple of years after the Ile-de-France entered service. And in my opinion, it's absolutely on a par with the best that the French themselves could produce. Even grander still was the Empress of Britain for the transatlantic service in 1931. And that's its first-class dining saloon with a Lalique glass fountain in the middle. And, you know, this is magnificent. It's also interesting to note that the balustrades and the forms around the clock are somewhat after the Glasgow style. So there's an interesting decorative link, I think, with earlier work by, say, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Some more interiors from the Empress of Britain. That's its first-class foyer, very hotel-like. This is its cafe lounge, decorated in a Chinese-influenced Art Deco style, in order to remind transatlantic passengers of the Trans-Pacific service to the Far East. And this was its cocktail bar with decorations by the cartoonist Heath Robinson. I think this interior is quite intriguing, or at least the photograph is intriguing. What appears to have happened is that this has been designed as a standee bar, but, you know, a sort of volume drinking type place where everyone would stand and drink a lot. But probably the clientele were quite elderly, and they probably said, we need seats. So they then brought in sort of grotty old chairs from somewhere else that are nothing to do with the design of the bar. It's got chrome nickel bar stools, and this lets the passengers sit down. So it's a practical solution to a problem, but it kind of spoils the integration of the design. McInnes Gardner produced many spectacular Art Deco design schemes. This is an original artist's impression by Gardner and his assistant Glenn for the first class, well, not first class, the only dining saloon. It was a one-class ship on the Monarch of Bermuda from 1931, built for a cross-trading service from New York to Hamilton in Bermuda. So it was a liner service, but kind of more like a luxury cruise, aimed entirely at an American clientele, but designed in Glasgow and made by Martins of Cheltenham for installation on a ship built on the River Tyne. And beautiful too. There is a photograph of that room in actuality, and there is the same ship's main lounge and smoking saloon. Really amazing. Now, we have to take a little break. We're making good progress from the decorative side of design to consider the safety side. In the 1930s or the early 30s, there were a number of very serious shipboard fires. And one of the worst in terms of loss of life was the destruction of the not particularly old American coastal liner Morro Castle, which was set fire to by an arsonist while sailing off the New Jersey coast. And over 100 people, 133 people were killed in the disaster. So a lot of focus in the mid-30s came to be placed on fire prevention. And the Americans developed a mandated system called Method 1 that insisted on fireproof construction using only fireproof materials. The British, who already had experience of using sprinklers for cargo holds and other areas that were perhaps likely to be damaged by fire, thought that it was better to use sprinklers that would cure any outbreak of fire. And so the use of sprinklers became commonplace on liners from the mid-1930s onwards. They're lovely objects. This is actually a little collection that I happened into in the autumn of last year at the Glasgow Vintage Vehicles Trust. A guy who preserved fire engines had rescued this collection of sprinklers from a manufacturer in London some years ago. And, you know, they're made of brass, so they would be got some scrap value, so that perhaps they might have been sold off and just melted down. But he's rescued them, and they're fascinating. They've got a little glass capsule, and the color of the glass tells you the temperature at which the sprinkler will activate. So an orange one will activate at 175 degrees, for instance. So these became a common feature of the deckheads of British passenger ships from the mid-30s onwards, especially so in the wake of a rather drastic experiment carried out on the Firth of Clyde on a brand new Irish Sea passenger ship built for the London, Midland and Scottish Railway by Denny's of Dumbarton. It was the first relatively large passenger ship with a comprehensive sprinkler system throughout all of its accommodation, passenger and crew. And the Department of Trade was very intrigued as to how effective this would be. So on the ship's sea trials, they set fire to a cabin. If this hadn't worked, the Princess Maud might have been the shortest lived passenger ship ever. There's a fantastic article in Shipbuilding and Shipping Record that describes what happened. During trials of the Princess Maud, which we attended on the Clyde last week, a cabin was intentionally set alight in order to demonstrate the effectiveness of the Grindle sprinkler installation. Cabin for this purpose, a two-berth, third class on sea deck, blah, blah, blah. 1 bulkheads of steel, the remaining 3 of plywood, finished in the usual manner with white enamel, blah, blah, blah. To avoid unnecessary waste, the wash basin was removed and of the usual fittings, only a mirror was retained. Each berth, this is great, each berth was covered with pitch pine shavings and the whole liberally sprinkled with naphtha, or petrol. After which a match was put to the lower berth. Immediately there was a fierce blaze accompanied by large volumes of pungent smoke, the flames coming out about 4 feet from the partially closed door. Within a few seconds, the sprinkler equipment came into action, and in about 15 to 20 seconds after the blaze was started, it was extinguished. Altogether, the sprinkler was in action for about 2 minutes, during which time we understand the output of water was estimated between 40 and 50 gallons a minute. So, very conclusive evidence that sprinklers worked superbly well. Now, it would be another 14 years until the SOLAS 1948 regulations recommended that sprinklers be widely used. In the meantime, the insurer Lloyd's of London insisted that sprinklers would be used as much as possible, so as a condition of getting insurance. And not only that, when ships were under construction, the sprinkler system had to be commissioned before outfitting began. If only Glasgow School of Art had done the same thing with the Macintosh building, we might have been in a slightly, didn't mention, but you know. So here's an image of the first class saloon on the Princess Maud, and there you can see the sprinklers in the deckhead, a very small and subtle change, but one that would have a profound effect on the safety of British ships. Quite simply, there were no more major fires on British ships when the sprinkler systems were commissioned and operating. Didn't help the Queen Elizabeth in Hong Kong, but its sprinkler system wasn't working when it burnt from end to end. Tremendous number of lives saved. It's also worth pointing out that the French decided neither to accept the British Method 2 system of using sprinklers, nor the American Method 1 system of fully fireproof construction. And instead, they developed their own system called Method 3, which had neither of these characteristics, and a very, very, very large number of French ships got burnt in the period from the 30s until recent time. Examples include the famous transatlantic liner Normandie, destroyed in New York. A less legendary vessel, but one that's become notorious in Scandinavia, was the French-built Scandinavian Star, which burnt out when crossing the Kattegat in 1990, situation rather similar to the fate of the Morro Castle back in 1934. So one can't emphasize the importance of this innovation. And even the new Cunard Queen Mary was fitted with sprinklers right from the outset throughout much of its accommodation. Construction, of course, was already underway when the new idea of having sprinklers came to the fore, and so the design was altered in order to include these. This vessel's interiors, incidentally, it's a complex story, too much to explain tonight, but essentially Cunard went to an American architect, Benjamin Morris, who had designed its office building in New York, and got him to be the architectural advisor, working with Arthur J. Davis, who had earlier been the designer of the Aquitania interiors. And the Queen Mary evolved gradually into being a very beautiful and modern ship on board. It was a massive project. I mean, this was the biggest passenger ship ever constructed when the outfitting project took place. So a lot of learning happened. One of the problems with the outfitting of the Queen Mary, incidentally, was that Cunard really had no idea of what it wanted, and it received a lot of unsolicited correspondence from really anyone who was anyone in the catering and hospitality and design and transport professions. All of this is still in the Cunard archives in the University of Liverpool. So here we've got Rupert Doyley-Cart of the Savoy Group writing to Cunard, Frank Pick of London Transport. All sorts of people sent their ideas. And the ship eventually was completed after a period of inactivity when the Great Depression was at its worst. The final outfitting was quite a crazy situation because there was a dirty rush to get everything completed. And you imagine outfitting a vessel, the staircases are rather important for getting inventory to all the different spaces where the equipment has to end up. And because there's masses of stuff going up and down the staircases, you can't outfit them until everything else is done, otherwise they'll get damaged. So to get everything into place and then to get the staircases completed meant a lot of overtime had to be paid. And there was a dispute between Cunard and John Browns over whose fault it was. It ended up going to a tribunal, and it was, of course, Cunard's fault. So John Browns then created a plan of the order of completions and decision-making that would be needed for the outfitting of the interiors of the subsequent Queen Elizabeth. And here it is. Everything has a date by which the decisions have to be made and by which the material has to be fabricated and delivered. Another issue, a bit like the tomato crisis of the present day, was a plywood crisis. There was a shortage of marine ply in the UK for outfitting. And so John Browns thought that they could get this from Germany. And that proved highly contentious and problematic as well, because obviously it was National Socialist at that time. In the end, the problem was resolved in a variety of ways. The Queen Mary and later the Queen Elizabeth proved immensely influential, and the streamlined Art Deco style of their interiors were much copied. This is McInnes Gardner's work for P&O. This is a McInnes Gardner scheme for Cunard's Mauritania, built on the Mersey in 1938. And here is the Queen Elizabeth, which was designed in the latter 30s, but which didn't enter civilian service until after the Second World War. Cunard had been criticized for its Queen Mary interiors looking a bit too flash and a bit too much like a, something down market like a Leicester Square movie palace. So they employed the designer of the Royal Incorporation of British Architects headquarters, George Gray Wernham, to do the Queen Elizabeth, which was a little bit more demure, but also a very beautiful ship and another big project. After the Second World War, a very, very large number of new passenger ships were commissioned, and McInnes Gardner was by this point the go-to British experts in ship interior design and outfitting. So they made many projects. This is Cunard's Caronia. This is the Arcadia for P&O, both built by John Browns. This is the first-class saloon in British India's Kenya, built by Barclay Carroll. Cunard attempted at certain points other ways of decorating. One was to use a former assistant of Arthur Davis called Leach, who was made to be the in-house designer for some new liners for the Canada trades of intermediate ships, also built by John Browns. The Festival of Britain in 1951 brought a fashion for scientific derived or scientifically derived patterning, chemical structural forms, atoms and molecules and these kinds of things, which Cunard attempted to replicate in the first-class saloon of the Saxonia. This was hugely criticized. The Architectural Review said that the ship looked as if mice had eaten it. And so for the next two ships, designed, in terms of their naval architecture, identical, they had Neo-Georgian interiors. These were the Sylvania and the Corinthia. Here's another weird one from the 50s, and one I experienced at firsthand myself, the Olympia of the Greek line, which was built for the Piraeus, New York trade. It had a room called the Zebra Room with zebra patterning. That vessel had an extremely long life, though, and it was still sailing as a cruise ship in the early 2000s, doing casino cruises out of New York. Here's a very young me on a two-nighter gambling cruise. This was before the World Trade Center was destroyed. So this is about 1999, 2000. And there is the dining saloon on the vessel in its latter years when it was the cruise ship Regal Empress, photographed by me. And it was a room designed by, of course, McInnes Gardner. The Zebra Room was chosen by the owners, and McInnes Gardner apparently didn't like it at all. They then worked a little bit later on another long-lived vessel that I experienced, the Empress of Britain for Canadian Pacific. There it is on sea trials in 1956. There's its Empress Room, main ballroom. There's a corner of the same room photographed by me in the early 2000s. And there's me on board it at Palma de Mallorca with the builder's plate. This is again McInnes Gardner's work, and it's rather in a 1930s idiom. It's not so different from some of, say, the tourist class rooms on the Queen Mary. And you can see perhaps that each one of these maple veneered panels has a little marquetry inlay. Each of these inlays was one of the Canadian Pacific hotels, things like the Chateau Frontenac and the Empress Hotel in Victoria. Little minor masterpieces beautifully crafted by H.H. Martin's joiners. Well, Empress of Britain probably represented one last hurrah for Clyde shipbuilding, because by the 60s, the industry was in very obvious decline. And just as in the 20s, in order to keep production running, it was necessary to take orders more or less at cost. And one almost disastrous project that fitted with that business approach was John Brown's agreement with the Swedish America line to build for it the transatlantic liner Kungsholm. The Kungsholm proved to be a very expensive ship to construct. Swedish American were a very demanding and awkward client who wanted most of the inventory to be Swedish made. Instead of Formica paneling, you use Perstorp, that sort of thing. And the correspondence between John Brown and Swedish American really shows how difficult the construction proved to be. The outcome was a very, very beautiful ship, but one which made a terrible loss for the builder. One of the other characteristics of Clyde shipbuilding in the 60s was a constant difficulty of poor labor relations and frequent disputes. Usually demarcation disputes where one union's members would down tools because a job had been done by a member of another union and they felt that this was, breaking the demarcation boundary. So when it came to doing the interiors of the liner that was initially known as Q4, but later became the Queen Elizabeth II, John Brown's produced a huge catalogue of demarcation instructions, specifying in extraordinary detail who was allowed to do what. And it's quite a sad document to read, because when you look back with the benefit of hindsight and you kind of know the history, you can see that the fact that this was necessary was effectively part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So the QE2's construction went well. The outfitting was more problematic, and the vessel was eventually delayed by some months and completed in Southampton. It was a remarkable achievement for British design, though. Very, very spectacular, unlike anything else that had been attempted before by any British shipping company or shipyard. Really a who's who of up-to-date and impressive modern designers were involved. And the end result, well, they kind of looked as if they were straight out of an early James Bond film. This is fusty old Cunard producing stuff that was pretty space age and very much of swinging London. So really the QE2 is where our story pretty much ends. A ship that more or less wiped the floor with all the other transatlantic operators and cruise companies, and which had, in the end, a very long and successful career and really put British design on the map, and was successful like few other modernist objects that were its contemporaries in terms of British architecture and design in the 60s. But it was also the last of its kind built on the Clyde. An inspiration, though, for the new generation of cruise ships. And it's interesting to think that when the QE2 entered service in 1969, already on the drawing boards in Finland at the Wärtsilä shipyards were 6 new cruise ships, 3 for the Caribbean, 3 for worldwide cruising, all of which took design inspiration from the QE2. But unfortunately, John Brown, the Upper Clyde shipbuilders as it become, and the other Clyde yards were not in a position to capitalize on that new market. That's me done in precisely 1 hour. Thank you very much indeed for listening.